Hello, now that we've got our impulse down our nerve, let's see what happens when it gets to the end to a place called the synapse. So we're going to work through the note sheet again, and I'm going to watch a video or show you on a video because to me, processes are always better when you see it through an activity. So we are going to look at what's going on, and I want you to pay attention to what is a synapse, what is a synaptic vesicle. Then you've got the synaptic cleft. Then there's the presynaptic neuron, which is the one before the synapse, and the postsynaptic neuron, which is the one afterwards. And then something called a transmitter or a neurotransmitter. So I want you to pay attention to those, define them, and then also notice what their part is in the process of the synapse.
The nervous system is composed of billions of communicating cells called neurons. Neurons conduct electrical signals or action potentials along the cell's membrane, along the axon to the terminus, where synapses are formed. The synapse consists of the membrane of the presynaptic cell, a synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic cell membrane. Since an action potential can only propagate along the neuron's membrane, a chemical known as a neurotransmitter must bridge the gap between the adjacent cells. The presynaptic cell releases the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, where they will move to bind the receptor proteins in the postsynaptic cell membrane. When the action potential arrives at the synapse, it opens voltage-gated calcium channels, resulting in an inward flow of calcium. The calcium binds to the vesicular membrane. This binding activates the vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane. As fusion occurs, neurotransmitter molecules are released into the synaptic cleft. Once in the cleft, the neurotransmitter molecules diffuse throughout the interstitial fluid in the cleft. Some of the neurotransmitters will cross the synaptic cleft and bind with receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. This binding produces an effect in the postsynaptic cell by opening the protein channels and allowing the flow of ions into and out of the cell.
Okay, that's a lot, so let's go back and look at what's going on. So once the axon gets to what's called the axon terminus, there is a space before it interacts with the next cell. That space is called the synapse. So here is our first neuron, and here is the second. The first neuron is the one that's before, so it's called the presynaptic neuron, and the one afterwards is called the postsynaptic neuron. In the presynaptic neuron, there are these little vesicles called synaptic vesicles, and inside contains the neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter is the chemical that goes from one neuron to the next neuron. So synaptic vesicles and neurotransmitters. So if we go through it again and look at the steps, the first thing that happens is calcium comes into these channels, and it is triggered by the action potential coming down the neuron. Then the calcium will then cause the synaptic vesicles to move to the synaptic cleft and release the little orange triangles. And the little orange triangles, so here you can see the exocytose releasing the orange triangles. And the orange triangles are the neurotransmitter. Then the neurotransmitter will go across the space, which is called the synaptic cleft, and it will bind with the channels on the other side. So it binds in a certain receptor site, and then when it binds, that will allow the channel to open. And when the channel opens, so here you can see the green things come through. So the binding of the neuron will activate sodium channels, and sodium comes through. And we just learned in the other video that sodium will change the action, or will change the membrane and cause an action potential. And that's pretty much how it works its way out.
In this installment, I will discuss synaptic transmission. Most communication between neurons occurs at a specialized structure called a synapse. The synapse is an area where two neurons come close enough to one another that they are able to pass chemical signals from one cell to another. The neurons are not actually connected, but are separated by a microscopically small space called the synaptic cleft. The cleft is less than 40 nanometers wide. By comparison, a human hair is about 75,000 nanometers wide. The neuron where the signal is initiated is called the presynaptic neuron, while the neuron that receives the signal is called the postsynaptic neuron. In the presynaptic neuron, there are chemical signals called neurotransmitters that are packaged into small sacs called vesicles. Each vesicle can contain thousands of neurotransmitter molecules. When the presynaptic neuron is excited by an electrical signal called an action potential, this causes the vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release their contents into the synaptic cleft. Once they are in the synaptic cleft, neurotransmitters interact with receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. They bind to these receptors and can cause an action to occur in the postsynaptic cell as a result. This action may involve increasing the likelihood that the postsynaptic cell will become activated and fire an action potential, or decreasing it. Eventually, the neurotransmitter molecules must be cleared from the synaptic cleft. Some of them will simply drift away in a process called diffusion. In some cases, the neurotransmitter is taken back up into the presynaptic neuron in a process called reuptake. Once back inside the presynaptic neuron, the neurotransmitter can be recycled and reused. In other cases, enzymes break down the neurotransmitter within the synaptic cleft. Then the component parts of the neurotransmitter can be sent back into the presynaptic neuron to make more neurotransmitter.
Okay, so this one went through all the steps again, but I want you to pay attention to what happens to the neurotransmitter at the end. There's kind of three processes. The neurotransmitter will disappear by diffusion, and once there's no neurotransmitter, the message doesn't pass anymore. So it can either diffuse away, or it can be reuptake, and then be recycled, or it can have an enzyme which breaks it down, and then those parts are recycled. So that's three different ways that the action potential can end. If you take away the neurotransmitter, the action potential ends and the communication between the two neurons are finished. So that is the summary of them. Hopefully that is enough to help you work through the check your understanding questions. Good. And then that's it for lecture summaries in this week. The next one, you just pay attention to what I call the nervous system. It's a 9-minute everything you need to know about the nervous system, and pretty much just pay attention to naming the parts, and that needs to be handed in too. Super. Thank you. Have a great nervous system discussion. Bye-bye.